Ready?
Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning we're interviewing Rik Katz as part of the Roots to Boots project for the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. Thank you for coming to us this morning. I understand you've come all the way from Atlanta
Yes,
for this
indeed.
interview
Yes.
because you used to live here in Dallas and you've come back to visit family for Thanksgiving. So we
Yes.
appreciate you taking your time to be with us this morning. What we like to do in these interviews, Rik, is to start by first asking you to tell us a little bit about your family history coming from Europe. So if you could start a little bit and tell us about the family history on both your maternal and paternal side coming from Europe prior to the South African experience.
Sure. Okay, so starting with my paternal side, my father was actually born in South Africa, in the Transvaal. His father came from Lithuania. I'm not sure of the date, but they were all born in South Africa. My mother came from Lithuania as well. She actually came as a young girl of about 8 years old in 1931. Her parents left just... Sure, well, my paternal side, my father was actually born in South Africa in the Transvaal. His father came from Lithuania. I'm not sure of the date, but all the kids were born in South Africa. And I think he came already as a married man. He was a family of 8, and they all moved to South Africa. On my mother's side, my mother actually came as a young girl of about 8 years old in 1931 with her mother and father. They came to Cape Town because her mother had relatives from Lithuania who were already there, and that's kind of their history. My father moved to Cape Town from the Transvaal, and they met in Cape Town and were married in 1947.
How did they meet?
I believe they met, in those days Muizenberg was the hot spot, and there was a Blue Moon Hotel there where the young adults used to go dancing. And I believe they either met at the beach or at one of the Blue Moon Hotel affairs.
Okay, so they met in 1947, you said?
Well, they got married in 1947, so I believe they must have met the year before. It was April 20th, so probably the year before.
And then tell us about the family history from there in terms of their marriage and the children.
Okay, so they were married in 1947. My mother lived in Muizenberg. My father lived in Kenilworth. My mother was one of 2 children. She had a brother. My father was one of 5. He had 3 brothers and a sister. And they originally moved into a house in Kenilworth where I was born and lived in that house for a few years together with my 2 brothers. We were all born and lived there.
What were the names of your brothers?
Jeffrey and Alan.
Are they older or younger than you?
Both younger. Jeffrey's in Houston, Texas. He's a doctor there, and Alan is in Winnipeg, Canada, and he's a doctor there. On my father's side, all 3 brothers did medicine. My father was an attorney. And we lived in Muizenberg for a while, where my mother was born and lived, and my grandparents lived, and then moved back to Kenilworth.
Where did you go to school? Did you go to a public or private school?
I went to a public school. It was called Wynberg Boys High School. I went to the same school that my father and all his family went to, and my brothers and I and our cousins went there, so I think there were 10 Katzes that went to that school.
All at the same time?
Well, over probably a period of 30 years, right?
And it was a boys' school?
Boys, yes. In South Africa, most of the schools at that time were very on the British cultural side. So there were boys' schools and girls' schools. You started in what we called Sub A, which was grade 1. And we went all the way to Standard 10, which was, of course, grade 12. And it was already in the same on the same school grounds.
And what types of youth activities were you involved in after school? Either of a Zionist nature or sports?
Well, I was heavily involved in sports. I played rugby and cricket once, rugby in winter, cricket in summer. I also went to Gaida, which was kind of the normal thing to do. But what I did do is I went to Gaida and continued my studies after my bar mitzvah and wrote the equivalent of a matriculation exam in Hebrew through the Gaida, basically. So I've got that certificate as a kind of, others would have taken it as part of their high school graduation subjects, and I did it kind of after school. Sometimes going after rugby practice, and they kept me pretty busy, which I think is a good way to bring up kids. Stay out of trouble.
Were you involved in any Jewish scouts groups or anything of that sort?
While at school, I was not involved in any youth movements. My youngest brother Alan became heavily involved in Habonim, but I really didn't have time. I was totally absorbed in the extracurricular activities at school and Gaida. When I went to university, I got involved, and I was at one stage chairman of the Student Jewish Association at Cape Town University, and was also on the national committee, and attended meetings in Johannesburg, which was a much bigger Jewish community, and even went to Israel a couple of times as a Jewish leader on leadership courses.
Tell us a little bit about your college experience then.
Well, I did what's called a Bachelor of Commerce, which is a business degree, really concentrating and majoring in accounting. I wanted to become a chartered accountant, a CPA. It wasn't really a very taxing time. I did have quite a lot of free time. I played a lot of chess and bridge in the student union. I played rugby at college as well. And, we had a good social time. Well, it works a little different in South Africa, of course, from here. It isn't broken by semester. You do one subject for the full year. So you would do accounting 1 in year 1 and accounting 2 in year 2, accounting 3 in year 3. It was a 3-year degree. I then joined an audit firm, which you have to do to become a chartered accountant. Spent 3 years there. Did a 1 extra year, postgraduate year, before I could write the board exams to become a chartered accountant. One thing I did do in 1967, at the time of the Six-Day War, was my first year at college. I'd spent a year in the army, which you have to do in South Africa, after graduating in 65, and spent 6 months in Israel as a volunteer just after the war. Arrived there probably a week after the war, and worked on a kibbutz in Israel for 6 months, or 5 months to be exact. And of course that was a very warming and gratifying experience.
Did you consider moving there at that point?
Not really. I was really focused on what I wanted to do career-wise, and that it wouldn't have been the right thing to try and move at that time. Funnily enough, though, in 1948, my dad had qualified as an attorney before, and he wanted to go in 48 and volunteer. The state of Israel was proclaimed war, and a judge at the time persuaded him that it was not the best thing to do at that time. He was already married and had a kid. So I guess there was a kind of a history to me wanting to go some 19 years later.
When did you meet your wife?
I met my wife, actually it's quite funny. I did accounting, and I was friendly with a group of other guys doing accounting. It was then after I'd graduated from full-time study and was working. And I went to an engagement party of one of the guys that we studied with and played little cards with. And his fiancée was my wife's best friend. And we met at that engagement party. That was in June of 1971. And we got engaged in December of that year. Got married the following year, July 72. So we still are very friendly with them, although we don't live in the same country. But my wife and her, Ida is her name, talk via email very frequently, and we're planning to go actually to Israel. They're having their first grandchild's having a bar mitzvah next year, and we are planning to go for that.
So tell me a little bit about your business life in South Africa at the time.
Okay, so I worked for 3 years for an audit firm. It was actually a Cape Town firm that then became a national firm and finally became what became Arthur Andersen in South Africa. So just by accident I'm considered an alum of Arthur Andersen, which I guess today isn't as meaningful as it used to be. And after that, when I was able to leave the audit profession, which I wanted to do, when I finished with my articles, I joined the Frame Group, which was a real huge textile conglomerate based in Durban, South Africa. My father had done some business with the chairman, some property transactions, and he knew that I was studying and living in Cape Town before, and he said, well, if he's interested in a job, let him give me a call. And I ended up moving to Durban after we got married, and worked there for 3 years at the Frame Group, and then moved to an international trade and finance company. It was a privately owned business, also based in South Africa, in Cape Town. I did some work for them in Johannesburg for 6 months, and then moved back to Cape Town. By then we'd had one child.
And that child's name?
Is Gregory, and he currently lives here in Dallas and is married, no children yet. And spent 3 years with them, and then moved to another international trade finance company in a more senior capacity, and finally left them with plans to move to the United States.
So tell me a little bit about why you chose to leave South Africa and move to the U.S.
Well, our first son was born in 1976, which was a little tumultuous time. The Sharpeville riots in South Africa, and conscription into the army was the order of the day, and guys were being stationed in Angola and on the borders, and some fighting and what have you. And she said to me, when our kids get bigger, I don't want them to have to go to the South African army and go and fight for something we don't believe in, and you need to promise me we'll move. And of course that was 1976. We had another son and a daughter, and by 1986, well 85 I guess, we decided that I was at an age that I was running out of time to re-establish a career, and it was time to leave. So that's when we started making plans to leave.
How did you choose Dallas?
That's an interesting story. I was involved with the United Jewish Appeal in Cape Town as one of the young people on the committee there. And every year there's a group out of the United States, children of very large donors, who used to go to various countries on a tour. And that year, and that was probably 84, the tour was in Cape Town, and we had a luncheon with them. And I ended up sitting next to a young lady from Dallas.
Who was that person?
Melanie Poses was her name. She's now Melanie Bloomberg, living in Chicago, last time I heard. And she said, if you ever want to come to the States, give me a call. I'm in Dallas. I'm very involved in the community. I can introduce you to the community. And her parents had retired to Kansas. I think they were in the shoe retail business, and obviously done very well. So when I came to the States, my brother was already in Houston. He'd been in New York and Cleveland, but settled in Houston. And he didn't know anybody in the business world to speak of. He was a doctor. So after I actually came on my own, on a visitor's visa, with 2 huge suitcases, with the intention of trying to find a way to stay in the States and then bring my family over. And he really there were no connections in Houston that worked, so I called Belen and said, I'm on my way. She was at that time buying, refurbishing and selling houses. And she actually was in a house in Highland Park or University Park, I think, off Inwood and Stoneleigh, Stonegate, one of the two. And she was living in that house on her own, and she said, you know, she's fixing it up and going to sell it. I'm welcome to come and stay there and see what's cooking in Dallas. And that's what I did. And she introduced me to a lot of the people, attended TexPac meetings, APAC meetings, and met a lot of the senior business people in Dallas. Nothing really came directly from that. But Tony Abrams from South Africa was involved in Sheriff here, and I'd met him, and he asked a few people at Sheriff, is anybody who wants to sponsor young accountants, not so young anymore, really. And somebody did. Steve Aaron, who runs Steve's
Absolutely.
Transport. And then it was a smaller business. He, a son, and somebody else were running it. And he said he was prepared to sponsor me. So we made an application. I got an H1 visa without having to leave town within, I think, 10 days. I got an attorney actually through Marty Ackerman, bless his memory, who was with, when he came to Dallas, he was with Commercial Metals. And they had an attorney who did a lot of their applications for immigration at that time. And he was a Spanish gentleman, and he was really very reasonable and did a great job. He had an assistant who took over and did the rest for me. And it went pretty smoothly for somebody who came on a visitor's visa. And I worked for Steve Aaron for about 3 or 4 months. And he said, you know, I really don't have a full-time job for somebody of your caliber. You need to really find a real job, so to speak. And I got introduced to the Rosenberg family, and met with Marcus and his son Steve, and they hired me in a kind of accounting analysis position.
With Arrow? With
Arrow Industries, and I spent 12 years with Arrow Industries. Went through the sale to Conagra and remained on for for 6 years, 6.5 years.
So at what point, how long were you here by yourself before Bev and the children came?
I arrived in the, funnily enough, I watched the Super Bowl 1986 in London at my cousin's house, and then flew out here just after the Super Bowl of 1986, which was the big 1st of Feb, I think. And they came round about the 19th of April, Bev and the 3 kids. It was a pouring, the weather was so bad I had to stop under a bridge coming home from the airport. And that was their introduction to Dallas.
So it sounds like you made some great connections with the Dallas business community.
Yes, I did.
As far as the community in general, and how did you feel in terms of your basic integration into the community?
Well, to be 100% truthful,
yes,
which I
absolutely.
guess is what you want.
Absolutely.
The South African community here and in other cities are wonderful. And the support system is nothing like you'll see anywhere else in the world, I believe. The way the South Africans support each other. And they were fabulous. The local American Jewish community were not that welcoming. For example, I wanted to join the JCC. I didn't even have a job, but they wanted money. And somewhere or other they said, well, if you want to join, you've got to pay something, and otherwise you can't come here. I wanted my kids to go to a Jewish day school. They wouldn't take them without money. I didn't have. I was not a wealthy boy. I was on my own. I didn't even have a good job yet. I was with Steve Aaron on, a few $100s a week. So it was a big struggle. I used money that was left in South Africa until there was no more. And it was really, I did not get involved in much of the Jewish community activities. What I did do, because of joining Arrow and the Rosenberg family, was I did become treasurer of Akiba for a couple of years.
So the children went to Akiba eventually?
A couple went to Akiba. My oldest went actually to what's now called, I think, is it the Levine?
Oh, yeah, Levine Academy.
Yes, the Levine Academy. It was not that at the time. He went there. The younger two went to Akiba, and I was treasurer there for a while. The Rosenbergs, of course, were heavily involved in funding it with Howard Schultz.
Right.
And that was my main activity in the community at that time. I joined the shul up here, close by you.
Tiferet Israel?
Tiferet Israel, and my oldest had his bar mitzvah there. And I was friendly with Daryl Meyerowitz. Bill Finkelstein was involved there. And that was kind of a split personality shul. On the sides you could be separate, and in the middle you could be with your wife. And we were used to separate, so I sat on the right-hand side, my wife was out on the left-hand side. And when they decided to start the Chabad shul, I moved across with the leaders of that community and was involved there quite a bit with Rabbi Dubrovsky. And I helped there on the committee and spent the rest of my time. And to this day, we are members of Chabad in Atlanta today.
So, at what point then did you leave Dallas and go to Atlanta?
Right. Well, eventually by mutual arrangement, actually, I left ConAgra. I had always worked with owners of businesses, even if they were big companies. In South Africa, when the owners went public, they stayed in control mostly. So I'd been used to working in a kind of, as a proxy for an owner. ConAgra was a huge conglomerate.
Right.
None of the managers seemed interested in what was best for the company. They were interested in what was best for themselves, which I think is quite common in big business in the States. So I was really not happy there, and I fought a lot with some of the people, and eventually we agreed it was best that I leave. And one of the products that we made was charcoal briquettes, and I'd been involved in the association representing the company in that industry. And a competitor in Atlanta offered me a job. They wanted to roll up the industry, buy out all the private label manufacturers, and hired me, and that's what we did there. Moved to Atlanta in '98, and have been there ever since.
Do you see any similarities or differences between the Dallas community and the Atlanta community, the Jewish community?
Not a lot of difference. I think today there are a lot of South Africans who are very involved in the community here. They are there too. From that point of view, it's very similar. I think Atlanta is a more conservative, kind of old style of living to Dallas. I think Dallas is a little faster and a little more upmarket, generally speaking. So from that point of view, Atlanta actually is less of a sort of a keeping up with the Joneses type of environment. Whereas here, I think it's people dress better, they go out more, they go fancier eating. So that community in some ways is a little easier to relate to at times. But I love Dallas, and we'd come back here maybe to retire one day, because my kids all grew up here and prefer to stay here, and they're all here. And our friends here were very good friends. We had as many. It was actually strange, when our son got married. We had friends from living in South Africa. We had friends from Cape Town, friends that we got to know in Durban when we were there for 3 years, who don't live there anymore. One does. One's in Toronto, Canada. One's down in Fort Lauderdale. And they came, and then we had our friends from Atlanta, which were maybe 20 couples, and then we had our friends from Dallas, which another 20 couples, so it was a kind of meeting of everybody, which was quite wonderful.
Do you have any family left in South Africa?
My wife's sister and her family live in South Africa. As much as we ask them to get their kids out of there, they're living there. We went to a wedding there in March. The second nephew got married. Other than that, nobody, well, I have an aunt who was married to my father's brother and her children live there. But over the years, you know, we've been away 28 years really, and you don't have that close connection any longer.
Do you go often to visit, or?
While our parents were alive every year, or at least every second year, Beverly, my wife went every year because her parents really couldn't afford to come that often. My parents came every year until my father died, basically, passed away. My mother kept coming after that. But yes, we were there frequently, at least every second year I went.
Is there anything you miss about home?
You know, I'm a person who looks forward all the time. So it's kind of out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. When I'm there, I love it, but I don't say, well, I wish I would move back. I love the United States. I've really taken to it, and I think in the long run, this was the best move one could make. It was the right decision. It's given my kids opportunities they would not have had there, and the lifestyle's good. You know, the standard of living here is really very high. If you look at the world, you can live better here than virtually anywhere else on a budget. And so, yeah, I miss the beach. We go to the beach here. I miss friends, and we try and see them when we can.
Are there any traditions or foods that you particularly like that you have brought with you over the years from South Africa to the United States?
For sure.
Tell
Quite
me about
a few.
Tell me about
Well,
them.
besides boerewors, which is the literally farm sausage,
Right.
where there's always a South African ready to make it, whichever city you live in. And in Atlanta, we've actually got a European butcher who one of the South Africans gave him the recipe, and he makes it for us and does a fine job. There's biltong, which is the dried meat. And we have friends in Atlanta who do that.
Problem is you can't get the eland.
Correct.
What do you make
We have
out of?
only beef. No eland, no springboks. Springbok's
Right.
excellent. No ostrich. It's all beef. And then, of course, my wife is a very wonderful cook. So her mother was a great teiglag maker, and she makes teiglag twice a year probably, before Pesach and before Rosh Hashanah. Distributes them to friends and family. One time we're selling them when we really needed the money. She makes kichel. Both of those better than you get in any shop here or there, basically. Some of the people here in Dallas know about it, I'm sure. And, well, the whole Friday night deal, chicken soup, kneedlag. No kreplach anymore. They lost favour somewhere along the line.
Are there any laws that are different that you know of between South Africa and the United States?
Laws.
Laws.
Generally laws?
Yeah, generally laws. Anything
Sure.
specific? Tell me about that.
Well, there's a huge difference really in, I would say, business ethics.
Oh, tell me. That sounds very interesting.
I would say, South Africa is very much on the English style. And for years, a handshake you could rely on. You went to an attorney and got an agreement signed. But you could trust somebody, and the agreement was really written as a recording of what you agreed. In the States, there are no ethics. The only sin here is getting caught. You can't trust anybody. You've got to watch everything, every legal document to the last T and I. Because if there's a loophole, the other party will find it. I had a neighbor who lived next door to me up here, and he did a deal with somebody and they fleeced him. He invested maybe 100,000, he got zero back. Only because of ethics. So I learned very quickly here that don't trust anybody. I became very familiar with a number of attorneys. And I did a lot of legal work in South Africa. I was lending money. You know, that's like you've got to have documents. So, and then of course the whole situation when somebody goes bankrupt is different here.
How is that?
In South Africa, every bankruptcy is managed by the court. There's no such thing as debtor in possession. You can't go bankrupt and continue to run your business and take out the same amount of money for yourself and have your creditors get paid less and less as you're busy living out of their money, which is what it happens here. There it has to go to a court and an external manager is appointed.
And that's the British system.
That's the British system, and South African company law is all British.
Oh, I see.
Some of the South African attorneys spend so many months of the year working in London as well. So that's a big difference that I had to learn quickly here, and to this day I'm still very familiar with company law and bankruptcies. I mean, we sell to people who go bankrupt, it happens, and you have no control here. You're kind of at the mercy of your debtor. And what he decides to do for you, that you have to accept. There's no way that you can do any better going through the legal system. So that I'd say is the biggest difference.
How are you involved in the Jewish community in Atlanta?
To a small extent.
What is your involvement there?
We get involved with really with my wife, with Weed Sow with my wife. I don't do a lot else right now. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, all right. Is there anything else that you think is significant and important that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to share with us? Either about family, about South Africa, about any of your experiences in the communities that you've lived in?
No, I would just like to, really emphasize how wonderful the South African communities abroad are and how they help and rely on each other. And they become your family away from home. Much more so than the communities that you enter. I think if we had to go to a city where there were no South Africans, it would be a real tough integration here. And I understand it to some extent, because you're in your community. Why would you want to have to welcome strangers just because they arrived here, And unless you have a business dealing or you meet somebody with a specific idea of getting to know somebody. Even us today, when youngsters come, you can only know so many people. You can only spend time with so many people. We have a huge number of friends and acquaintances, and we probably wouldn't be able to add too many more to that, so I do understand it. But that is something that immigrants need to understand, of course. They're not waiting for you.
Well, it's very nice to have the support system.
It is, it's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, Rik, it's just been a wonderful pleasure speaking with you today. I thank you so much for taking your time away from your family to come and talk with me today.
Sure, well, I think it's it's important, and I wish my parents had done this, because time flies, and at the end you haven't asked all the questions and they're no longer there to answer.
That's right, and this will be a legacy for your family, for your children, and for the Dallas Jewish community.
Sure.
We really appreciate your time today. Thank
Good.
you so much.
Thank you.